Lady Dahlia and her poodle. The Caledonian sleeper rattled into Euston Station just as the first pale light of a spring morning touched the London sky. It was April 1890, and the platform thrummed with the usual early bustle. Porters wheeling trunks, newsboys crying the morning editions, the sharp hiss of escaping steam. Among the descending passengers was a young woman of striking presence, tall, dark-haired, with a direct gaze and a carriage that spoke of both breeding and independence. This was Lady Daliah Doyle, only daughter and heiress of the late Sir James Doyle of Cregmore Park, an estate lying just south of Glasgow whose fortunes had been built upon coal and the great shipyards of the Clyde. She stepped down from the first-class carriage with the easy assurance of one accustomed to being noticed, yet indifferent to it. At her side, held lightly on a slender silk lead, trotted a small black toy poodle whose coat gleamed like polished jet. The dog's collar glittered with tiny sapphires and a silver tag engraved with the single word, Coco. Coco had been her mother's last gift before consumption claimed her, and Lady Daliah rarely went anywhere without him. A liveried footman from the Mayfair townhouse her solicitors had taken for the season hurried forward to relieve her of her travelling cloak. Behind him waited a gleaming brougham bearing the Doyle crest, a stag rampant on a field of azure. Within half an hour the carriage had conveyed her through streets already alive with hansoms, omnibuses and the ceaseless flow of the capital's commerce, until it turned into a quiet square of elegant brick houses. The rented house was modest by Glasgow standards, but perfectly situated for the coming months. Close enough to the parks for morning rides, near enough to Bond Street for necessary shopping, and, most importantly, within easy reach of the theatres and assembly rooms where the season unfolded. The days that followed passed in a pleasant whirl of calls, fittings and invitations. London society, ever eager for fresh faces backed by solid Scottish fortunes, received Lady Daliah kindly. She possessed wit enough to amuse without offending, beauty enough to turn heads without inviting censure, and 25,000 a year. Whispers varied as to the exact figure, but all agreed it was handsome. On the evening in question she dressed with particular care. An invitation had arrived from Mrs. Harrington Blythe, a distant connection by marriage, to join her party at the Savoy Theatre for Mr. Gilbert and Mr. Sullivan's newest triumph, the Gondoliers. Lady Daliah chose a gown of deep emerald silk that set off her dark hair and the famous Doyle emeralds at her throat. Coco, freshly brushed until he shone, wore a narrow ribbon of matching green tied in a bow about his neck. The Savoy, that marvel of modern comfort, blazed with electric light as her carriage drew up beneath the portico. Inside, the foyer hummed with the fashionable crowd. Ladies in pastel satins and diamonds, gentlemen in impeccable evening dress, the air fragrant with hothouse flowers and Parisian scent. Mrs. Harrington Blythe's party occupied a box in the grand tier. Lady Daliah greeted her hostess and the other guests with easy grace before settling into her seat. Coco curled contentedly upon her lap. The orchestra struck up the lively overture, the curtain rose upon a sunlit Venetian piazza, and for the next hour Lady Daliah surrendered herself to the infectious music and Mr. Gilbert's inimitable wit. When at last the act concluded amid enthusiastic applause and the lights rose for the interval, she rose with the others, intending to stretch her legs and perhaps take a turn in the foyer. "Come, Coco," she murmured, gathering the silk lead. "We shall see what refreshments the famous Savoy crush bar has to offer." Little did she suspect, as she stepped out of the box with the little dog trotting at her heels, that the evening's entertainment was only beginning. The foyer of the Savoy Theatre during the interval of the Gondoliers was a scene of controlled pandemonium, the sort that passed for fashionable recreation in 1890. Electric chandeliers blazed overhead, the theatre's proud boast, for it had been the first public building in the world to be lit entirely by electricity, casting a steady, flattering glow over the throng below. Ladies in gowns of satin and lace drifted like bright-plumaged birds. Gentlemen in white tie and tails formed shifting knots of conversation. The air carried the mingled scents of hothouse roses, cigar smoke, and the sharp tang of champagne. Lady Dahlia stepped down from the box with Coco trotting daintily at her side. The silk lead looped loosely about her gloved fingers. She had no intention of venturing far, only far enough to stretch her legs after the confinement of the seat, and perhaps to accept a glass of iced lemonade from the refreshment counter. Mrs. Harrington Blythe had remained in the box with two elderly dowagers, declaring herself too comfortable to move, but several younger members of the party had joined the general exodus toward the crush bar. "Dahlia, my dear," called a bright voice, and she turned to find Lady Eleanor Forsyth, an acquaintance from her Glasgow days whose family now kept a house in Belgravia. "How splendid to see you in town at last, and with your little black shadow as ever." Lady Eleanor bent to admire Coco, who submitted to the attention with dignified restraint. They fell into easy conversation, mutual friends, the merits of the new operetta, the latest scandal involving a certain marchioness, while slowly edging toward the long counter where white-aproned waiters dispensed drinks and ices with practiced speed. Around them the crowd thickened. A portly gentleman in naval uniform backed inadvertently into a waiter carrying a tray of champagne coupes. Glasses tilted, bubbles spilled, and a ripple of laughter and apology spread outward. Someone began humming the catchy cachucha from the first act. Others took it up. The noise rose in a good-natured crescendo. Lady Dahlia felt Coco shift at her feet, no doubt made uneasy by the press of boots and swirling skirts. She glanced down to reassure him and saw that he had moved a little ahead, nose twitching toward a fallen program that smelled intriguingly of printer's ink and perfume. "Steady, boy," she murmured, tightening the lead a fraction. At that moment, a sudden commotion erupted near the foot of the grand staircase. A young man, evidently a little the worse for pre-theatre brandy, had attempted a playful bow to a passing actress and collided with a flower seller's basket. Orchids and carnations scattered across the marble floor in a vivid carpet. Exclamations rang out. Half the foyer surged forward either to assist or merely to observe the spectacle. In the resulting confusion of bending figures and shuffling feet, Lady Dahlia felt a sharp, brief tug upon the lead. She looked down at once. The silk ribbon ended abruptly in a clean diagonal cut, as though sliced by a razor. Of Coco there was no sign, only the empty loop dangling from her hand and a sudden, dreadful hollow in her chest. "Coco!" The name escaped her lips more sharply than she intended. Heads turned. Lady Eleanor straightened, startled. "What is it?" "He's gone. The lead has been cut. Someone has taken him." For a moment the bright clamour of the interval seemed to recede as though heard through thick glass. Then panic sharpened her senses. Lady Dahlia pushed forward, scanning the crowd, low to the ground, seeking a flash of black curls, a glint of sapphire collar. She called his name again, more urgently. A gentleman nearby asked if he could assist. A waiter offered to summon the manager. But the minutes were slipping away, and with them the chance of spotting a small dog in that shifting sea of evening dress. The bell rang, 5 clear notes warning that the second act was about to begin. The crowd began to flow back toward the auditorium doors, carrying Lady Dahlia's hopes with it. She stood rooted near the refreshment counter, the severed lead still clutched in her fingers, while the bright electric light seemed suddenly cold and merciless. Someone had stolen Coco, deliberately and with chilling skill, in the very heart of London's most fashionable theatre. And as the orchestra tuned for the rise of the curtain, Lady Dahlia knew with icy certainty that the evening's true drama had only just begun. The second act of The Gondoliers passed for Lady Daliah in a blur of music and colour that she scarcely registered. She had returned to the box only because Mrs. Harrington Blythe insisted, declaring that a scene in the foyer would do no good and that the dog might yet be found curled beneath a seat. But every burst of applause felt like a mockery, and when the final curtain fell amid tumultuous cheers, Lady Dahlia was the first to rise. In the end, no trace of Coco emerged. The theatre manager, a harassed little man with a waxed moustache, expressed profound regret and promised to question every usher and attendant. A constable was summoned from the street, took cursory notes, and suggested that such things happened now and again with fashionable pets. Ransom usually followed. Lady Daliah heard him out in icy silence, then allowed Mrs. Harrington Blythe's carriage to deposit her at the Mayfair house long after midnight. Sleep proved impossible. She paced the drawing-room in her evening gown, the severed silk lead still knotted about her wrist like a sinister bracelet. Coco was more than a pet. He was the last living link to her mother, the small warm presence that had shared every carriage journey and quiet evening since she was 16. The thought of him frightened, confined, or worse was intolerable. At dawn, she penned urgent letters, to her Glasgow solicitors, to a cousin in the Guards who kept rooms in Albany, to the editor of The Times requesting a discreet notice. But even as she sealed them, she knew they would achieve little. London was vast, its underworld vaster still. A black toy poodle might be spirited across the river or onto a train before breakfast. It was the footman who, shortly after 9, brought in a plain envelope on a silver tray. No stamp, no direction beyond Lady Daliah Doyle, Mount Street, in rough block letters. She broke the seal with fingers that trembled only slightly. Inside lay a single sheet of cheap notepaper and a small tuft of glossy black fur. The message was brief. We have the dog, £500 in notes, unmarked, left in the third pew from the rear, north aisle, St. Martin's in the Fields, tomorrow midnight. Come alone. No police, or the animal suffers. You will hear from us again only if you obey. Lady Daliah stared at the words until they danced. The tuft of fur was unmistakably Coco's. Soft, slightly wavy, with that distinctive blue-black sheen. She pressed it to her cheek and felt the sting of tears she had not allowed the night before. £500 was no great sum to her. She could draw it from Coots that afternoon. Yet the thought of yielding to such creatures, of rewarding their cruelty, revolted her. And there was something else. The clean precision of the cut lead, the speed and silence of the theft amid hundreds of witnesses. This was no casual opportunist. Someone had known exactly where she would be, when she would move, and how to create the necessary distraction. She rang for her maid and ordered a simple walking dress. Then she summoned a hansom and gave the driver an address in Baker Street. If the official police were to be avoided, there remained one man in London whose name had reached even the drawing rooms of Glasgow. A consulting detective who concerned himself with matters too delicate or too peculiar for Scotland Yard. Lady Daliah had no intention of paying a ransom blindly. She would recover Coco, and she would see his abductors answer for it. The cab rattled through streets bright with morning sun, past flower sellers and crossing sweepers already at their posts. By the time it drew up before a familiar door numbered 221B, Lady Daliah had composed herself into the picture of determined calm. She paid the driver, gathered the ransom note, the severed lead, and the tuft of fur into her reticule, and mounted the steps. The page boy who answered her ring showed her up a narrow stair to a sitting room already hazy with tobacco smoke. There, seated in a basket chair with a pipe clenched between his teeth, was a tall, lean figure in a dressing gown. Beside him, rising politely, stood a shorter, soldierly gentleman with a moustache. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" she asked, her Scottish vowels crisp in the quiet room. The lean man removed the pipe and regarded her with keen grey eyes. "I am he, madam, and unless I am much mistaken, you are here upon a matter both urgent and personal. Pray take a seat and let us hear the particulars." Lady Daliah drew a steadying breath, sat, and began her story. Dr. John Watson, chronicler of his friend's exploits, would later describe the entrance of Lady Daliah as that of a Highland storm confined in emerald silk. She entered the sitting room at 221B, with the door closing firmly behind her, reticule clutched in one hand and chin held high. Yet the keen observer would have noted the faint strain about her eyes, and the telltale redness of recent weeping hastily repaired. Sherlock Holmes rose from his chair with his usual angular grace, motioning her to the basket chair opposite his own. Watson, ever the gentleman, remained standing until she was seated. "You have the advantage of me, madam," Holmes began, resuming his seat and steepling his long fingers. "For although I perceive you to be a lady of Scottish birth, recently arrived in town, and in possession of considerable independent means, the precise nature of your errand remains to be stated." Lady Daliah regarded him steadily. "Then I shall waste no time, Mr. Holmes. Last night, during the interval of the Gondoliers at the Savoy Theatre, my dog, a black toy poodle named Coco, was stolen from me in the midst of the crowd. This morning I received a ransom demand for £500, accompanied by proof that they hold him." She opened her reticule and laid upon the table the severed silk lead, the folded note, and the small tuft of fur. Holmes's eyes brightened with the familiar spark that Watson knew well. He leaned forward, took up the lead first, and examined the cut edge beneath a magnifying lens he produced from his pocket. "Interesting," he murmured. "A single stroke, clean and oblique, made by a narrow blade of exceptional sharpness, possibly a surgical scalpel or a cutthroat razor honed to perfection, not the work of an amateur opportunist." He turned next to the ransom note, holding it to the light, then sniffing faintly at the paper. "Common stock, sold by the ream in any stationer's shop from here to Glasgow. The ink is cheap, the hand disguised by block capitals, yet the writer is educated. Note the spacing, the alignment. The tuft of fur is genuine, recently clipped." Lady Daliah watched these operations with restrained impatience. At last she spoke. "All that is very well, sir, but can you recover him?" Holmes laid the items down. "Pray give me the full particulars from your arrival in London to the moment you discovered the theft." She complied, recounting the evening with clarity and precision. The invitation from Mrs. Harrington Blythe, the box at the Savoy, the decision to take Coco into the foyer, the spilled flowers and subsequent confusion, the sudden slackening of the lead. She mentioned those she had spoken to, Lady Eleanor Forsyth, a naval officer who had apologized for the champagne incident, a waiter who had seemed particularly attentive. Holmes listened without interruption, eyes half closed, only occasionally asking a sharp question. Had she noticed any person taking unusual interest in the dog beforehand? Had anyone known her exact plans for the evening? Were there recent changes in her household or business affairs? At the last question, she hesitated. "My father died 8 months ago. The estate is entirely mine, though there is a distant cousin who fancied himself nearer the succession than the law allows. And there is a gentleman who sought my hand and was refused. But I cannot believe either capable of this." "Belief is a luxury we may postpone," Holmes said dryly. "The theft displays foreknowledge and professional execution. Toy poodles of good breeding fetch high prices, yet the ransom is modest for one wearing sapphires. There may be more here than simple dog napping." He rose and paced the room in his restless fashion. "I have noted 3 similar incidents in the past month. Lapdogs taken from fashionable venues, ransoms demanded and paid. In each case the animals were recovered unharmed, the thieves vanished. Yet the pattern suggests organization." Watson ventured, "A gang specializing in society pets." "Precisely, Doctor. But this case differs in the precision of the cut, the choice of venue and," he glanced at Lady Daliah, "the prominence of the victim." He turned to her. "Will you place the matter in my hands? I shall require the freedom to examine the Savoy, to trace the note's delivery, and to act without reference to the official police for the present." Lady Daliah met his gaze. "I will, Mr. Holmes, only bring Coco back to me safe." "Then return to Mount Street and await events. Reply to no further communication without my advice. Watson, I fancy a visit to the Savoy before the staff disperse." As Lady Dahlia descended the stairs, Holmes was already reaching for his ulster and deerstalker. Holmes lost no time. While Watson escorted Lady Dahlia back to Mount Street with instructions to admit no strangers and to note any loiterers, the detective himself took a hansom directly to the Strand. The Savoy, though no longer thronged, still hummed with morning rehearsals and deliveries. Armed with a card from the manager, who remembered the previous evening's disturbance only too well, Holmes was permitted to examine the foyer at leisure. He moved like a bloodhound, eyes darting over every surface. Near the spot where Lady Dahlia had stood, he discovered a single strand of black poodle hair caught in a crack between marble tiles. Confirmation, if any were needed. More telling was a trace of ash upon the brass rail, coarse Turkish tobacco, not the finer blends smoked by the Savoy's usual patrons. A waiter questioned closely recalled a man in evening dress who had lingered unusually long by the flower stall, lighting a cigarette just before the orchids were spilled. The man had worn a heavy moustache and carried a Malacca cane. From the theatre, Holmes proceeded to the mews behind Mount Street, where he interrogated cabmen and crossing sweepers. One sharp-eyed boy remembered a closed fly that had waited opposite the house early that morning and driven off swiftly after a barefoot urchin delivered a letter. The fly bore no distinctive markings, but the boy had noted the driver's scarred cheek. By evening, Holmes and Watson met again in Baker Street. Over a cold supper, Watson reported what he had learned from Lady Dahlia. Her father's death had followed a bitter dispute with a rival shipbuilder, Mr. Archibald Vance, whose yards at Govan had lost several admiralty contracts to the Doyle firm. Vance had been heard to vow revenge. More recently, a young man named Captain Ralph Harrington, nephew to her hostess of the previous evening, had proposed marriage and been firmly refused when Lady Dahlia discovered his debts at Faro. Holmes listened, then produced a small object from his pocket, a brass button shaped like a fox's head. "Found in the kennel yard behind a dubious pet shop in Southwark," he explained. "The place is known to receive stolen dogs. The button matches those on a coat worn by Captain Harrington. I observed him wearing it at Ascot last year." Watson stared. "You suspect the captain?" "I suspect he is a tool, not the hand that wields him. The ransom is too modest for a man in his straits, and the Turkish tobacco points eastward, perhaps to a foreign agent interested in the new armoured cruiser design Sir James Doyle was developing for the Admiralty. Plans rumoured to have been kept in the family safe at Craigmore. A second note had arrived at Mount Street that afternoon, raising the demand to £800 and naming a new drop. A hollow tree in Hyde Park near the Serpentine, midnight. Lady Dahlia, under Holmes's instructions, had sent no reply. That night, under a thin moon, Holmes and Watson concealed themselves among the trees. At 11:30, a figure approached, slight, muffled in a dark coat, carrying a small wicker basket from which came a faint whimper. Holmes's bull's-eye lantern flashed. The figure started like a deer. It was Captain Harrington, pale and trembling. Confronted, he broke almost at once. He had been hired for £50 to collect the dog and hold it until further instructions. The actual thief, he swore, was a man he knew only as the Professor, a foreigner with a soft voice and a heavy moustache who frequented certain gambling hells in the East End. Harrington had acted from desperation. Vance had refused him a loan, and his creditors pressed. Holmes bound him loosely with his own muffler and left him to Watson's custody while he followed the trail to a narrow street off Ratcliffe Highway. There, in a dingy room above a chandler's shop, he found Coco, unharmed, curled upon a folded coat, guarded by a swarthy man with a Malacca cane who proved remarkably willing to talk once faced with Holmes's revolver and the prospect of Newgate. The Professor was in truth a disgraced naval architect from Bremen, employed by interests eager to obtain Sir James Doyle's plans. The drawings, reduced photographically to microscopic size, had been concealed in a hollow compartment within Coco's sapphire collar. The dog had been chosen as the safest courier. No customs officer would think to examine a lady's pet. With the plans recovered, the foreigner secured, and Captain Harrington left to the tender mercies of his aunt, who would doubtless settle his debts to keep scandal from the family name. Holmes returned to Baker Street just as dawn was breaking over the rooftops. One task remained, to restore a small black poodle to his mistress. The sitting room at 221B Baker Street was bathed in the clear light of a April morning, when Lady Daliah was shown upstairs for the final time. She had come alone, in a simple walking dress of dove grey, her face pale but composed. Holmes stood by the window, hands clasped behind his back. Watson occupied his usual chair, a small wicker basket at his feet from which came the occasional soft rustle. Holmes turned as she entered. "Madam, I am pleased to inform you that the affair is concluded to a satisfactory degree." Lady Daliah's eyes flew at once to the basket. "Coco is here, unharmed and eager for his mistress." Watson lifted the lid, and the little black poodle sprang out with a delighted yip, tail pluming like a banner. He bounded straight to Lady Daliah, leaping into her outstretched arms and covering her face with ecstatic licks. For a long moment she could not speak. She simply held him close, burying her face in the soft curls of his neck, while tears, relieved this time, slipped down her cheeks. When at last she looked up, Holmes resumed. "The immediate thief was a foreign agent seeking certain naval drawings your late father had kept in the family safe. Photographs of the plans had been concealed in a hollow compartment within Coco's collar, an ingenious hiding place, for no one suspects a lady's lapdog of carrying state secrets. The theft was arranged to secure both dog and collar before you returned north." Lady Daliah stroked Coco's head, her expression hardening. "And Captain Harrington?" "A dupe, driven by debt." He arranged the distraction at the Savoy and held the dog briefly, believing the motive to be simple ransom. His confederate, the man who actually cut the lead, has been taken by the river police. Harrington himself has been persuaded to enlist for service in South Africa. His aunt will settle his debts to spare the family name. The prime mover, the disgraced Bremen architect, is already on his way to Berlin in the custody of two quiet gentlemen from Whitehall. The plans are recovered and will be returned to the Admiralty. Watson added, "A neat piece of work, Lady Daliah. Your quick decision to consult Holmes prevented a serious breach." She rose, still cradling Coco. "I am more grateful than words can express, Mr. Holmes. You have restored to me the one thing that cannot be measured in pounds or plans." She placed a small velvet pouch upon the table. "Your fee, sir." Holmes waved it away with a slight smile. "The case possessed features of interest. Let us call it settled." Lady Daliah hesitated, then extended her hand. Holmes bowed over it with old-fashioned courtesy. "I shall return to Scotland next week," she said. "London has been instructive, but I find I prefer the winds of Lanarkshire to the fogs of the Thames." "A wise preference," Holmes replied, "though fogs, like secrets, have a habit of following one home." She laughed softly, the first genuine laughter Watson had heard from her, and took her leave, Coco tucked securely under her arm. When the door closed, Watson turned to his friend. "A trifling matter, you will say, the theft of a poodle." Holmes filled his pipe from the Persian slipper and struck a match. "On the contrary, Watson. It began with a vanished lapdog and ended with the safeguarding of naval supremacy. There is a certain poetry in that. You may make what you will of it for your notebooks, though I suggest the adventure of the naval collar might prove too transparent." Watson smiled and reached for his pen. Outside, the bells of London rang in the spring morning, and somewhere in Mayfair, a small black poodle curled contentedly upon a silk cushion, his sapphire collar gleaming innocently in the sunlight. The case was closed.